Scott McBurney, and I'm here to talk about the health of bats and its relationship to people. So basically I'm going to talk about 4 different things, and I look at it as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Yordi and Tessa, they come here and they tell you everything's about fluffy animals eating fruit, they're really cute, there's rainbows, there's really nice hugs and kisses and everything. I'm here to put the hammer down and say, you know, these are all the nasty things that are going on, and so I don't get to do the fun part of the talk. I have to bring reality home to everybody. But in saying that, like, I hope that at the end of this, especially in terms of diseases that bats carry that affect humans, what's more important to take away is they're significant diseases, especially rabies, but we can take ways to mitigate their effect on us and protect ourselves in good ways, and it doesn't have to be a big fear factor type thing. So first I'm going to talk about bat white nose syndrome, the perfect storm, and then I'm going to talk about these other diseases that bats carry, and there'll be time for questions throughout. So what is our concern for bats? Well, it's like you already said, it's white nose syndrome right now, and white nose syndrome started off in this cave here in Upper New York State. It's Howe's Cave. It's a show cave. That means that it's visited by tourists from all over the world, tens of thousands of visitors every summer, okay? And the hypothesis that's there, the idea is that somebody visiting from Europe, probably a well-intentioned tourist, an eco-tourist, somebody that wanted to see nature and that sort of thing, just happened to have spores or a little seed-like type structure, or conidia it's called, from a fungus, on their coat, on their pants, perhaps in some mud in their boots or something like that, and when they visited that cave, they accidentally introduced that particular fungus to that cave, because white nose syndrome is caused by a fungus, okay? And it took a little while to kind of figure out, because this was in the winter of 2005-2006 that they first started to see these bats emerging from hibernation and dying, and associated flying in the winter associated with this disease. So, as I said, it was caused by a fungus. They discovered that this fungus was the confirmed cause of the disease or etiology way back in 2009. And at that point in time, the fungus was caused something easy to say, Geomyces destructans. But then as time went on, molecular people got looking at things, and they finally decided to call it this name up here, which is a little bit more of a tongue twister. They like to do that. Pseudogymnoascus destructans. And I'll just call it PD for short for the rest of this talk, okay? And it is a fungus, like I mentioned. And here's the fungus just growing on a plate in the lab, okay? And it's like a mold that you would see growing on a wall, or other things like that that you've seen in your home sometimes, or perhaps growing out on wet wood and that sort of thing. And it's got this mycelial form that is like, and it's kind of better on this screen over here actually. Can't get my pointer to show it, but it grows in this mycelial form that these little branches and everything like that. But more importantly, as an identification feature, it has these things, like I said, that are kind of like the seeds of the fungus or the spores of the fungus, and the fancy name is conidia. And they're kind of like little banana shapes, right? And that's really important because this is the only fungus in North America that we know that have spores that look like that, so that it helps us identify it under the microscope when we see these spores present on bats, when we're looking at bats that have died or that are sick and we've taken swabs off them and that sort of thing. So why do I say it's the perfect storm? Well, the first point of the perfect storm is that this particular fungus is something called a psychrophilic fungus, and psychrophilic just means cold-loving. So a lot of fungi like to grow in warm temperatures. This one likes to grow in colder temperatures, anywhere from 3 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius, and it grows optimally at around 13 degrees Celsius. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, you already mentioned that bats like to hibernate. And when bats hibernate through the winter, they actually lower their temperature to the ambient temperature where they're actually hibernating, which is usually roughly 3 degrees Celsius to 6 degrees Celsius, okay? So all of a sudden, this warm-blooded animal that normally runs at a temperature like us, 37 degrees Celsius, has lowered its temperature to the temperature that this fungus likes to grow. So all of a sudden, they've become the perfect little petri dish or growth plate for this fungus to start to grow on. Okay, so that's the very first stage that sort of sets this perfect storm up. And not only does it grow on the surface of the animal, but it actually starts to invade the tissues of the animal, and particularly the tissues of the wings. The other thing in the perfect storm is the bats that are most severely affected by the disease are bats that like to snuggle together when they're hibernating. They like to hibernate in clusters, okay? And we all know for a fact what happens in terms of disease transmission when we're close together versus far apart. So this individual over here is very, very smart. She's staying away from everybody else. She's hibernating on her own, and she's not going to be exposed to everything that this cluster of people here, if somebody's got the flu or something like that, that they're able to disperse it more easily with people that are in close contact with them, right? The other part is the bats that are most susceptible to this disease are also water challenged through the winter. So they like to hibernate in conditions of very, very, very high humidity, anywhere from 95 to almost 100%. So as you look at the fur of these bats as they're sitting here, it's quite moist and they're quite damp. That doesn't make them cold. And it helps them maintain their water over the winter because they're hibernating and they're not taking a lot of time to go drink and do those sort of things, okay? The next part of the perfect storm is that as much as this fungus will grow on these bats while they're there, after the bats die from the disease or they leave that hibernation site at the end of hibernation period, that fungus could move right back down into the soil or live on the walls of those caves and persist there until other bats come back and be ready to infect them when they come back. So it's just kind of a number of just different factors have all combined to bring this all together to make it just kind of a really devastating disease for the bats that are affected. So here we are back again. You see Howe's Cave right at this kind of epicenter of the disease up here where I told you it came out. After 1 year, you can already see it's already spread out a distance of roughly 0 to 15 kilometers, and it's already affecting these additional hibernacula and squares there, okay, where bats are hibernating. 2 years later, it's already moved out to a distance of roughly 210 kilometers, okay? So you can see it's an epidemic. It's rapidly spreading. It's a big concern, okay? And when people were looking at this initially, they were trying to figure out, well, how is it spreading so quickly? I mean, people are not going in and visiting all these caves, and it's not likely being moved around by people at this point in time, so how are bats moving it around? And initially it was thought that bats that were leaving their hibernacula in the spring were likely carrying that to their summering sites, and then there was transmission of bats from other hibernacula that were at those summering sites, and they were transmitting it that way. And they looked at kind of the old information, and as usual, when things like this break out, we realize how little we know about species and not how much we know about species. But they did have old studies where they had banded bats and in their hibernation sites, and then found those bands in the summer to figure out how bats dispersed and where they went on the landscape in the summer. And one cave they've been doing that at for quite some time was Aeolus Cave up there. And this next slide shows, so there's Aeolus Cave in the center, and all these dots are recovered banded bats, okay, that came out of hibernation, and that's where they went to spend their summers. And if you look at the way that kind of looks, it looks the same thing as that circle as they emerge. The only problem was, when they looked in swabbing those bats in the summertime, they couldn't find the fungus on the bats any longer, okay? So it wasn't really a summertime transmission thing. So then they had to go back to the books again and think about the way bats' biology works, and it comes back to that period that you already talked about, swarming. And the main idea for swarming is that's when you want to find your mate, all right? So you go to a site, you swarm, you go into that hibernation site, you might not settle there for the winter, you come back out, you mate, and then you decide, okay, I'm going to go on and try to find another mate somewhere else, and you go to another swarming site. So if the first swarming site you went to was infected with the fungus, like I said, and you're flying in there and roosting for periods of time, you pick up spores of that fungus, and then you carry it to the next swarming site with you that might have been uninfected, and then you introduce it there. And that's how most transmission they feel is occurring now, is the bats are actually the ones moving it around in the landscape and not so much humans, but humans are still involved. So what do I see at necropsy? Necropsy is just another word for autopsy, okay? And that's what we do, is we look at the bats and examine them to try to see what they died of at various times of the year. And the thing about this fungus is it kind of melts away when it's brought into warmer temperatures, although on some bats that have been found and kind of dried up a little bit. You can see the powdery remains of the fungus on their wing membranes here and around their nose. Most often with live bats that are brought in, they're found on the landscape, they're still alive. This isn't from a hibernation site. And what we see most often are these wrinkled wing membranes like this, okay? And the tail membrane is also really wrinkled and everything. And normally when you spread out a bat's wings, it's like this here, down here, they become quite smooth. But this bat's wing is stretched out and you can see how wrinkled that is there. And it's because there's all kinds of ulcers, like you know the sores you get in your mouth, open, shallow sores in your mouth. There's all kinds of ulcers on those wings. The skin's been taken away. It's weeping fluid, and you know when you cut your finger, you've got that little bit of blood in a small cut, and you'll see the yellow fluid that forms around it, the clear yellow fluid. Well, that's serum, and that serum is quite sticky, and it sticks everything together in that as well. And they're losing a lot of sticky fluid, and there's a lot of damage to the skin in those areas that cause that wing membrane to kind of just stick together like that. If you backlight the bats, sometimes you can see these clear areas that represent ulcers. And then biologists and others will go into caves to see if bats are affected, and they use UV light, and they open up the wing membranes and look at them, and the lesions actually fluoresce under UV light, and so you can look at live bats that way to determine if there's anything going on. Under the microscope, so what I've done here is I've just cut off the wing membrane from a bat, and I've taken it between my fingers and I've rolled it into a little small ball, and then I've taken a section across it, okay? So what that represents here is a coiled up piece of wing membrane, okay? The black on the surface represents the skin, the surface of the skin, and then the bluish colored material that you see in the middle is the connective tissue that's supporting that wing membrane. And all the pink that you see on the surface here, and you can see those little branching tree-like structures, that's the mycelium of the fungus that we talked about. And then here we can see these banana-shaped structures, the seeds or the spores or the conidia of the fungus there that let me know that that's Pseudogymnascus destructans growing on the surface of that. And in severe cases, what happens is that fungus literally replaces all the tissue of the wing. So it's used the tissue of the wing as a mold, and it's just kind of grown in and through it. And then when the bats wake up and warm up, their wings literally just dissolves away into tatters, okay? And I told you about the ulcers, and that's the fungus here growing deep, so you can't see the surface skin there anymore, and it's starting to grow deep, deep down into the connective tissue and that sort of area as well of the wing membrane. So that's what sort of lesions I see under the microscope, or damage to the skin I see under the microscope. So, like I said, every time you encounter something new, you have to go into this learning mode, and I went into a big learning mode about this. And the proposed pathogenesis just means, how does this particular disease-causing agent cause these animals to be sick and die, sort of thing. And what's important is the bat wing skin, so just the wing skin alone, counts for 85% of all the skin on the bat's body. So the body skin only accounts for 15%, and the wings count for 85%. And what's important about the wing membranes is during hibernation, those wing membranes are actually dynamic membranes, somewhat like frog skin, okay? So they can do several things metabolically or physiologically through their wings, all right? They're important for maintaining water balance. They're important for maintaining blood pressure. So think about all that blood network that goes out through those wings. If I was to hang any of you upside down and leave you hanging in the back of the room just for the day, where would all the blood sort of pool in your body as you're hanging there? In the head, right? So what happens, bats are hanging upside down. Those networks of blood vessels helps keep the blood dispersed throughout the body and not pooling in that down part, okay? Body temperature, it also helps them maintain their appropriate body temperature, but most importantly, it helps them breathe. Cutaneous respiration means breathing through their skin, just like a frog can breathe through its skin. And that's really important. We go outside on a cold day in the wintertime, and I know for me it was a huge thing when I was a kid. I'd blow out that huge plume, right, of foggy material, and I'd be pretending I was smoking away, blowing this stuff out, right? Well, what that actually is moisture from your lungs, right? And that's why during the winter, when you're out exercising and doing that sort of thing, you are losing a lot of moisture out into the environment and you have to drink more. So if bats were hibernating and had to breathe through using their lungs as opposed to their wings, they'd be losing a lot more water, and they would have to wake up more often in order to replace that water, which is difficult for them during the winter, because every time they wake up, it takes more energy. Okay, so that's really important to know. So where a lot of researchers are now is they think that what's happening is because of the damage to the wings, the bats are having to breathe more through their mouths, so they're losing more moisture that way, right? They're having to use their lungs to breathe. The damage to the skin itself, like I told you, the ulcers and the open sores on those wings are weeping fluid, and I call that fluid serum. Well, that serum has lots of sodium and chloride in it, okay? So they lose those electrolytes as well. Plus they're losing fluid through their wings. So what happens is that they lose blood volume. So their blood volume gets much lower. And because it's losing fluid, it also gets much thicker. And because they're not breathing through their wings as much anymore, they're also accumulating carbon dioxide in their blood, right? Because we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is accumulating, and they get this thing called metabolic acidosis. And all those things combined together give a thirst drive for us. And so they think they're waking up more frequently due to this thirst drive, and they want to replace that water loss primarily, okay? Problem is, bats get most of their water from the insects they eat, as opposed to drinking water. They absorb the water from the prey, and it's balanced with electrolytes. If you have lost a lot of electrolytes, so anybody that's heavy into hockey or runs marathons, do you drink clear, pure water as you're exercising, do it like that, or do you drink something else? What do they usually tell you to drink?
Gatorade.
Gatorade. And why do they tell you to drink Gatorade? What's in it? Electrolytes, right? So the bats don't have those sources of electrolytes where they're hibernating. You just have clear, pure water. And if you try to replace the water with clear, pure water, it won't stay in the blood vessels anymore, and it leaks out in the body, and that could be a problem too. So a colleague of ours, Dr. Craig Willis at the University of Winnipeg, decided let's see if behavior and let's see what exactly is going on with these bats. So there's the control bat there, not infected with white nose syndrome, and there's a bat that they infected with the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. So these shrunken, dehydrated, damaged, sticky wings right there. So what they did with the experiment, and here's the control here. So there's the skin temperature on this axis, and the day of the experiment on this axis down here. And so you see what happens every so often, every 10 to 20 days or so, the temperature spikes up to around 27 degrees. Then it goes back down to 5 degrees, then back up to 27, then down, then up. And that's normal, okay? Bats, even when they're hibernating, have to wake up occasionally. They wake up for several reasons. They wake up to groom, they might take a small drink. They actually have to wake up to sleep, because hibernation is an altered metabolic state. It's not sleeping. And they have to actually spend time just resting, doing nothing to kind of catch up on that. And then there's probably also this sentinel type thing. Is there anything wrong with my body? Is there anything going on? Is there any threats or anything like that? Everything's okay, I can go back down to sleep. So you can see how regular that is, okay? Then they infected bats with North American Pseudomonas destructans, the fungus that causes the disease. And at the beginning of the experiment, it almost mirrors, okay, what's happening in the control animals. But as we get to the end, they're waking up almost 2 to 3 times more often. Look at how much more those spikes are going up. And the thing about that warming up, it takes 400 times more of the energy to be at that warm temperature than at that lower temperature. And think about if you had to go to sleep in November and not wake up till May, and you kind of put on all the fat and everything that you thought that you needed to do that, but then all of a sudden you're burning 400 times more of the energy 3 times more often. You go through that fat pretty quick, and then you have to wake up and go find food, right? And that's what those bats are that are emerging. They're emaciated or very skinny, and they're looking for food. Then they actually went back to Europe and got some of the fungus from there. And the same thing at the beginning of the season, everything's kind of the same, but at the end of the season, they're waking up 3 to 4 times more often. And as represented by the mortality curve for this particular study, so if you look at the control animals in black at the top, they all survived the whole experiment, okay? And the ones that were infected with the North American fungus in red died, all of them died by 120 days of the experiment. And the ones infected with European PD, the one that woke up the most, they died before 100 days, okay? So again, very, very significant. This whole hypothesis associated with dehydration and water loss, another study, it just showed that the fungus just devours the wing tissue, they lose their waterproofing, as opposed to water being held onto their bodies, it wicks away from their wings, so they're not able to absorb it. They, as I said, they increase water loss through breathing, as well as the leakage of that fluid due to the damaged tissues. They have the susceptible species, which are the little brown myotis, the northern myotis, and the tricolored bat, have the highest rates of water loss, higher rates of water loss than European bats. So that's a fairly good explanation, but maybe doesn't account for everything. And I'll talk about another thing in a second. What Craig did want to do was measure how much water these bats were actually drinking. So he had a water dish down here, and he was going to measure the volume of water they were drinking. But bats are pretty smart. So you see that bat there in the study that's woken up. Is he flying down to the water dish? No. What he's doing is he's licking condensation off the plastic that was covering this, and that's where he's getting the water from. They want to conserve as much energy as possible, so they're not flying down to a water dish to get water when there's water around them. So this is another hypothesis, and it's the grooming hypothesis. This is a little, a northern myotis here that was delivered to our lab, and before it was euthanized, you can see how actively grooming it is there. It spent all its time trying to clean its wings, was working on its wings, and this other study by these individuals here suspect that that drive to groom might have something to do with them waking up more often as well, okay? It's white nose affected bats at the top and normal bat on the bottom here. And the only things you have to look at are 2 things. The grooming, okay? So a normal bat, when they've woken up during hibernation, only spend roughly 1% of their time grooming, whereas a white nose affected bat spends 22% of its time grooming. So where does it steal that time from? Undetectable movement, or when the bats are sleeping and resting. In a normal bat that wakes up during hibernation is a roughly 71% of the time, but it's 45% of the time, only 45% of the time on white nose affected bats. So again, they don't get to rest as much and sleep as much, they're spending more time grooming, and there's that drive to do that. So several things are all adding up to cause these animals to die through the winter. So you guys are on the cutting edge right now. There's 13 species of hibernating bats are affected in 33 US states and 7 Canadian provinces. Just within the last few weeks, that's a picture of a fringed myotis, just due to that fringe at the bottom. That's a new species in North America affected by white nose syndrome just in the last few weeks. It's a hibernating species. As I've mentioned, these are the most common species, and they've all been listed as endangered in Canada just due to this disease, okay? There's 16 additional species at risk in North America, and those are all hibernating species, and the suspicion is that they will be affected similarly by this fungus, but we don't know that yet. Here's a startling figure, 75 to 99% mortality in affected hibernaculus, so that's really, really high. And an estimate of roughly 6 to 7 million bats died since emergence, but look at the date on that, that's 2012. There's been many more millions of bats that have died since then. And then Jordy's mentioned this whole thing of what ecological servicing bats do for us and how important they are in the ecosystem, so we don't want to really lose them. So what about the Canadian perspective? Well, if you want to look at the Canadian perspective, of course, we have to be in Eastern Canada. And this is the situation in the winter of 2008, 2009. It was kind of bumping up against you here in New Brunswick. This is where it had happened, okay? This is where white nose had been positive, and this circle represented where it was potentially going to show up that winter. And of course, it circled areas of Ontario and Quebec. And so our colleagues from the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative in those areas wanted to start to look to see whether they find this disease and cooperate with biologists and other scientists. But of course, they had to say, well, where are the bats hibernating in our areas? And a lot of it, times they just didn't know where they were actually hibernating. So they had to think about what the process was. And bats, of course, hibernate. The Appalachian Mountains provide lots of good hibernation sites for bats as that passes all the way up. Other areas are these things called these solution caves, okay? So caves that are karst deposit or that have this limestone bedrock. Water can drip through cracks in the rock. It dissolves the rock. It opens up bigger openings that eventually are big enough that bats can get into and hibernate. In Nova Scotia, there's these gypsum deposits in Nova Scotia. Same thing happens in the rocks there. Form great hibernation sites for bats. Okay, so they're really good. Abandoned mines. You know, we've done a good job as humans creating a lot of habitat for bats as well, right? And this is a map of New Brunswick here showing all the mine openings, roughly 377. There's 600 in Nova Scotia, 2,200 in Quebec, so on and so forth. But the big problem with them is they've been secured, and the reason why they're not open for people to go into is they haven't been maintained over the long term. Okay, so there's nobody going in doing maintenance, making sure the supports are there for the ceilings. A lot of the coal mines have toxic gases in them and that sort of thing, and very dangerous to human health. So there's huge occupational health and safety requirements to be able to enter those structures and really get an idea of how many bats are hibernating in those areas, okay? So that first year they did identify a number of sites, but they went in and checked, and everything was copacetic for that first year. Everything was good. The following winter, not so much. So this is the winter 2008, 2009. 9 out of 12 localities were confirmed white nose positive in Ontario, and 11 out of the 22 they were monitoring in Quebec were positive. Okay, and the map shows where they are, and one suspect location there. This is the chain link fence. It's a south-facing slope. And all those brown blobs that you see are bats out on the landscape looking for food, but very emaciated, trying to absorb sun on those rocks there. That's snow down below, so you can imagine how desperate they are. And this was one of the caves that they went into, and the bats were affected, okay? And so now we start to see the epidemic in Canada just marching its way across. So it was the following winter that it hit Atlantic Canada, okay? And white nose confirmed in little brown myotis collected from 13 separate locations on the landscape and 1 hibernaculum, including 5 counties, and a mass mortality that Don McAlpine and Karen Vanderwolf identified in Barrington Cave and monitored it all through the winter. And asked Don at some time during a break here of an interesting story about raccoons and that particular mortality and what they had to look at that he published a paper on that was interesting. But you can see it going right across here, okay? So on the landscape I've got highlighted because if you're going to do anything with this disease, you have to participate with citizen scientists to help you find it, because we don't know where all the hibernacula are, and a lot of times it's people that have just told us there's bats here, there's bats there, and that's how we've been able to identify mortalities throughout the region. The winter 2011-12, first Canadian case in a tricolored bat, and that was in New Brunswick. You guys hold the prize. Not much of a prize to hold, but you guys have it. 2012, 2013, there we are in PEI, and you can see from the epicenter here, it's just sort of slowly spreading out, just the same thing that it's doing in Ontario and Quebec, okay? And we had high numbers of northern myotis that particular year, don't know why. This on the landscape, I want to highlight again, is really important. This was from a conservation officer in Nova Scotia, Dave Harris. He was driving this section of highway down along 5 Islands for several months during the winter, and what he identified was bats laying on the snow, bats on homes and cottages in the area, hanging off shingles. He collected well over 1,000 bats just doing that drive every day. And they hypothesized a whole bunch of things. They thought there might have been a hibernaculum on 5 Islands. They went out and looked, they couldn't identify anything. There was an abandoned mine in the area. They went up and checked there and couldn't find anything. All the bats that died in that particular instance Never did find the hibernaculum that they emerged from. They had no idea where it is. But without people calling and telling him about those bats and finding the bats, we would never have identified that mortality. And we learned as well in PEI, the dogma at the time was that bats left PEI after the summer, just like all the other tourists, and went other places to spend the winter, right? And it was that Nova Scotia and New Brunswick had the best hibernation sites for bats, so that's likely where they were going in the winter. So when white-nose first showed up on PEI, it made sense. It showed up on our south coast. That was this, and this here were the first 3 cases we got. And we thought, okay, they're coming out of hibernation in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia and getting blown over to us. But then we started to see all these cases on the North Shore, right up to the tip of Surrey and everything like that, and we had to start thinking about bats are hibernating somewhere on the island because these bats are emaciated, they can't fly very far, there's no way they're flying long distances to get here, sort of thing. So what is going on? And we had people calling in and saying, they're hibernating in my basement, they're hibernating in my wood pile, they're doing this and that and the other thing. So we decided to collaborate with a student and just take people at their word, and wherever they said bats were hibernating, we went and investigated. And the way that we did is we set up these things called hobos that monitor temperature and humidity, and then we set out acoustic monitors to try to get any sounds of bats that would be hibernating in those areas. And we tested them all, anywhere that people said. We didn't find them in most places, and the conditions weren't suitable for them to hibernate. But sure enough, on a very cold day in January, it was like minus 24 degrees C. You could see the steam coming out of this well and the nice green on the top of it. And at the top of that well, we collected 16 dead bats, little brown myotis and northern myotis, that had emerged out of that well. And the only reason we were able to collect those is the homeowner, to protect this well and from people falling in, had built a screen structure over the top of it so that people wouldn't do that. The bats came out. There were crow tracks all the way around. Any bat that got close enough to the fence, the crows had picked it through. And these bats were closer to the center where the crows couldn't pick it up. So nature is really efficient. And that story with raccoons shows how efficient nature is as well. So then we were able to identify that site on PEI. For Don's interest, this is the basement of the house that you received all the bats from that they cleaned out. That we have one other hibernation site in an old home with a stone foundation. And pest control operators were called in the middle of the winter to remove the bats, and Don received those bats at that point in time. So here we are. The spread continues elsewhere. That's the most current map today, and you can see that in Canada, of course, it's reached Newfoundland, and it's gone as far west as Manitoba. These are interesting. We had this long range jump a number of years ago where it skipped all through kind of the central US and ended up in Washington State. They were worried about a separate introduction from this coast here. They checked the fungus. The fungus was identical to the fungus from over here, so that wasn't the case. They thought it was a bat that might have been transported from here to there. They checked the genetics of the bat. The bat was a western bat. So the only explanation that we can come up with for that site there, the initial occurrence there, is that it was likely people moved and possibly people that like to cave as recreational activity. So you've got cavers from the East Coast that possibly went out to that area there to do caving, used the same equipment they've been using in caves here, contaminated with the fungus, and introduced it over there. I've got a star here because this is the biggest problem that we have. There's no white nose at that site, even though it's recorded as white nose, but they've detected the fungus on bats. Just because you have the fungus on an animal doesn't necessarily mean it causes the disease, right? You have to actually show the sickness as well as the organism that causes the sickness. So we don't know what's going to happen there, but the thing on the West Coast, they have a greater species diversity of bats on the West Coast. So maybe some of those bats won't be susceptible to the disease. They can get affected with the fungus and not be susceptible to the disease, and we want to be able to identify that. So where we are now is it's all about prevention, and that's why you guys are here today. We want to talk about the fact that we want to conserve bats as much as possible, and excluding and evicting them from buildings which are major concentration areas for them. It's important to do that properly so you don't cause any problems for the bats. Of course, we talk to cavers, guides to decontamination. We want to work with pest control operators and others doing research and that sort of thing so they don't spread it around and are aware of health concerns for themselves. So now I get to talk about all the nasty stuff with bats. And I mean, bats are even in the news very currently right now as well. So what is the concern? So the concern is that bats carry greater than 60 viruses that can infect humans. And some of the big bad ones are on the list here. Rabies is on there. SARS-CoV, you can possibly remember that from around 2002, 2003. Came through wet markets or animal markets in China, and then made its way to Toronto. It was quite a significant concern. Respiratory virus again, okay? There's the Nipah and Hendra viruses that affected Australia and Southeast Asia. And then there's this big one down here with the question mark after it. They think that bats are probably the ultimate reservoir for Ebola virus, but they haven't identified that to be sure yet. And then, of course, we're dealing with this novel coronavirus right now that's spreading throughout the world, but mainly focused in China again, likely related to the wet markets or animal markets, okay? And the virus is, depending on where you read, 85 to roughly 90% homologous with those found in horseshoe bats in China. So again, bats appear to be the reservoir, but we have to be important what we the takeaway message from that type of information, okay? And I want to highlight that. So this YouTube video at the bottom that's down there, and this is what's important, this is the takeaway message, okay? Bats are unique. As you already mentioned, bats have been around us for a very, very, very long period of time, okay? And they're the only flying mammal. So they've got several adaptations that allow them to kind of live with viruses and not get sick from viruses, okay? One thing that happens is when they start to fly, their temperature goes from 37 degrees to roughly 40 to 41 degrees Celsius, okay? Any of us that have been ill and we've had a temperature of 40 to 41 degrees Celsius, what do they call that? A fever, absolutely right. And that's because we have an infectious organism in us, likely a virus, and part of our body's response to that is to raise the temperature to try to get rid of that nasty organism in our bodies. So that's one thing that they have going for them. The other thing is a flying animal, it does a lot of tissue damage to the muscles and that sort of thing because it's such a strenuous thing to do. So bats actually have rapid DNA repair mechanisms as well to help them deal with that tissue damage effectively and rapidly repair the tissues. So that probably is something else that allows them to survive viruses fairly well. What's the other thing bats do to affect their temperature? Something we talked about already this morning. Well, they hibernate, right? And what happens when they hibernate? They lower their temperature, remember, to the ambient temperature in the cave or mine that they're in, right? So think about trying to be a virus in an animal that is at 37 degrees, then goes up to 40 degrees, then goes into a hibernation site for 6 months and lowers its temperature to 3 to 6 degrees Celsius. There's nothing consistent there for that pathogen at all, so it's really, really tough for it. The other thing that they've looked at in bats is that they lack a gene responsible for mounting major inflammatory responses. And as much as inflammation can help us overcome infections, if we get too much we get over the top inflammation, it actually damages our body. So bats have this dampened immune response that we don't have and don't get that over-exuberant inflammation as well. Lastly, the other thing to remember is that bats, they study bats physiologically to help understand us in health and disease. Bats like the vampire bat that you already talked about also have a potent anticoagulant that in their saliva that they have so that the blood won't clot when they're trying to lick it up from the animal that they're feeding on. And that anticoagulant has been used in humans as a potent clot buster for strokes and that sort of thing to help people recover from strokes. So there's lots of good things in bats. And the takeaway message here is it's like SARS-CoV or this novel coronavirus. It's because bats are being brought into cities in closer contact with us, okay? In Australia, Malaysia, You know, fires and that sort of thing have moved bats into residential areas where we're maintaining trees and that sort of thing because their natural habitat has been destroyed. Deforestation, creation of pig farms, then putting fruit trees on pig farms led to Nipah virus coming out as well. So it's this close association that we have and habitat destruction. So if we want to prevent getting sick from the viruses that bats carry, let them have their hibernation sites, their roosting sites, their natural habitat separated for where we choose to live our lives. Let Batman kind of deal with the crashing plane with all the sick people on it and save them sort of thing. And this simple separation from us and the bats will save us from a lot of these disease problems that we seem to be having today. So it's not the bats, it's more us that's causing these types of problems, okay? But still, there are bat diseases that bats carry that we can come in contact with. And the important thing with a disease like rabies, which is fatal in humans, it causes us to die, is recognize that it's there and then take appropriate precautions on handling bats to prevent it. The only thing I want you to know, sort of note here, is that Lyssa is Greek for rage, fury, or canine madness, okay? Rabies has been around. The first written report of rabies was in a dog 4,000 years ago in the area of sort of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, that Syria, okay? So as humans, we've been dealing and working with rabies for well over 4,000 years, okay? So it's been around. We know that it's there. And there are lists of viruses, and there's various special genotypes. The only thing that you need to know is genotype 1 is classical rabies, the one that we all know about and think about. It's in terrestrial animals, predominantly carnivores as reservoirs, okay? This is showing domestic dogs and cats, but also carried in bats. And then, of course, like we talked about, bats carry a lot of other viruses. So when we look at a lot of the other lists of viruses, we see our friend bat. So, you know, they do have this reservoir. They carry a lot of viruses, but this is the one we're going to talk about today. The other really important thing to know about this, there's a few things. In North America, we look at this as primarily a disease maintained in wildlife populations, okay? So we think about rabies, it's out in wild animals. For those of you that travel the world, please remember that rabies is still a fairly significant disease in dogs and cats in areas like South America, India, and those sort of things. You're walking along the street, you see the cute little dog or cat, you reach down to pet it and it bites you and it may have rabies. So just keep that in the back of your mind. We've done a vaccination program with our domestic animals, which has kind of pushed rabies back into wildlife populations, and so that's where we think of it as being. And the thing under this umbrella of rabies, classical rabies, you've got to think of two things. Terrestrial rabies and bat variant rabies, and they're a little bit different, okay? And then under these, you have the fox variant, raccoon variant, and skunk variant in North America, and then the spillover. And they're only named after the fox, raccoon, and skunk because those are the reservoir species. The virus works most efficiently in those species and maintains itself there. But rabies can spill over and affect any warm-blooded animal. So fox rabies can affect a cat. Fox rabies can affect a cow. Fox rabies can affect a porcupine. You know, like you can go across. Rodents are less likely to be infected with rabies, but you've got to think about it that way, okay? And the other thing about terrestrial rabies is we tend to see outbreaks of rabies when you're dealing with terrestrial animals. And you guys know better than anybody else in Maritimes of Canada because you've been dealing with raccoon rabies and trying to eradicate that. And there's an individual at the back there, Jim Goltz, has spent, as well as Jackie, has spent a lot of time dealing with raccoon rabies in New Brunswick, okay? And so you see these spikes where large numbers of animals can be infected with that virus, okay? Bat variant rabies is a little bit different. There's 13 species of bats that are affected in Canada. Basically, all our bat species can be infected with rabies, all right? And the difference is you don't see outbreaks of rabies in bats. Rabies kinds of simmers along in the bat population anywhere from 0.5 to 1% of the bat population is infected with rabies at any point in time. So the possibility is there that if you go into a maternity colony of bats in an attic and there's 100 bats in there, one of those bats possibly has rabies, okay? So that's a good way to kind of think about it. But they're different, and you got to think about them a little bit differently, and you have to basically recognize wherever there's bats in Canada, there's rabies. If terrestrial rabies might not be there, like Newfoundland doesn't have terrestrial rabies, PEI doesn't have terrestrial rabies, but we do have bat rabies, and a lot of people forget that, So, okay, here's some maps of terrestrial rabies in Canada, and you see rabies moves on the landscape. So here's an old one from 1988. Fox variant rabies was in the Western Arctic then. Before that, it was actually down here, and it left this little infected area of fox variant rabies in southern Ontario that's persisted there for a very long period of time. Skunk rabies is here, okay? Raccoon rabies was primarily restricted to Florida until some good old boys that needed some raccoons to hunt from Virginia decided to go down to Florida in their truck, load up a bunch of raccoons, move them up there, and one of them was infected with rabies, and off goes the rabies outbreak from there, right? So that's an important thing too, not to move wild animals around because you move diseases with them. So a little bit later, now the fox strain is in the eastern Arctic, and it actually tipped down and went into the northern peninsula of Newfoundland. You guys have had some incursions of raccoon rabies up in this area of New Brunswick, okay? And skunk variant rabies has stayed in this area fairly consistently as well, okay? So you've had that for all that period of time. You've got to look at bat variant rabies differently. So there's Canada with our 13 species. It's coast to coast to coast, so wherever there's bats, there's rabies. US, it's I think 33 species, just they've got a greater species diversity. Then you head down here to Brazil and you see this down here, and you see that they've got a similar 33 species. So wherever there's bats, there's rabies. There's a couple of places in here, it's not showing up as clearly on this map, that it's clear they don't have rabies. It's not that they don't have rabies, it's that people aren't doing surveillance for rabies, to look for rabies. If you don't look, you don't find, so you actually have to do that, okay? So here, this was the year-to-date samples for rabies cases in Canada 2019, and this is the fall report. This is the end of the year report. So there may be individuals here that have more current information. But for Atlantic Canada, New Brunswick, you're the rabies capital for Atlantic Canada. And at that point in time in the fall, you'd had 3 cases in bats, and you'd had 1 case in a skunk. And I think the skunk was from the St. Stephen area and had raccoon variant rabies, okay? There were 3 bats. 1 was a big brown bat from Fredericton, and I think then there were 2 hoary bats from the Sackville area, is that correct? Yeah, so there you are. You've got those 4 cases. The rest of the Maritimes and Atlantic Canada, there are no cases. Ontario is the rabies capital of Canada. Why? They've got raccoon rabies there. They had a major incursion of raccoon rabies in and around the Hamilton area that they're working to get under control and are getting it under control. They have that remnant fox variant rabies that I told you, that little nidus of infection there, and they have bat variant rabies, and that's reflected in the numbers. You know, 37 bats that were collected had rabies, okay? 1 dog had rabies. That dog would be really important to check what rabies it has. It could have had bat variant rabies, or raccoon variant rabies, or fox variant rabies, depending on the area of the province that it was in, okay? They had a mink with rabies, they had raccoons with rabies, they had 13 skunks with rabies, okay? So that's how it kind of works. And then as you go across Canada and bats, like I said, it's kind of coast to coast. So BC had 7 cases of rabies in bats, and then we come over to the east coast with New Brunswick this particular year with 3 cases of rabies in bats. So anywhere where there's bats, there's rabies. This is just to remind you, okay? So here's Nova Scotia doesn't have terrestrial rabies, PEI doesn't have terrestrial rabies. But look, both provinces, we've had clusters of cases of rabies in foxes. In both instances, there were bat variant rabies. This one here was in 1993, and this one here was in 2002. Other thing I want to point about the Mulgrave Harbour case, that was a community that was actively engaged in feeding foxes. They, as a community, were attracting foxes to feed in an area, and then they had this small cluster of rabies cases, and there were 2 dogs that have been fighting with the foxes as well that were included in this. So again, feeding wildlife, particularly carnivore species, is not the greatest idea, but foxes and with bat variant rabies, and that's important to realize. This is a slide that was provided to me by Jim Goltz and Mike Allen, okay, just doing the counts. And so, and you talked to Don McAlpine as well. We're seeing increased numbers of big brown bats in New Brunswick, and probably they're filling the niche that has been vacated by the little brown myotis and the northern myotis that have been impacted by white nose syndrome. Big brown bats can get white nose syndrome, but they're not impacted as heavily due to the way they hibernate. They hibernate in buildings quite frequently, which brings them in closer contact with humans through all seasons of the year, potentially, okay? So in 2015, we only had one case, but this 2017 was a big year. There were 6 cases of rabid big brown bats. 2 cases involved human contact with post-exposure prophylaxis. Treatment required in 1 case involving a domestic dog exposure. The 2018, actually the data is down here. I got it off the website for CFIA, and you guys had 4 rabid big brown bats in 2018, and this year, as I pointed out earlier, 1 rabid big brown bat and 2 rabid hoary bats. Okay, so you've got it here, you've got it in bats, you also have it in raccoons, but people have this innate thing with raccoons and skunks and that sort of thing. They recognize them as larger carnivores that can bite. You don't tend to think of bats necessarily as potentially exposing you to rabies as much as those other species, at least in the general public. But here we go. So that was 2019 in your paper, okay? 4-year-old boy bitten by a rabid bat in Heartland, New Brunswick. And bat bite prompts rabies warning in New Brunswick from 2018. So these are the things that Jim and Jackie and people like that, they deal with, and other people from health are dealing with, assessing these cases, deciding if post-exposure prophylaxis needs to occur. But the more we can help people recognize not to handle bats in their bare hands or pick them up, and the other things that go around that, the better. So what are the clinical signs? Well, they're variable, and they vary over the course of an illness. But the most important thing to know, rabies affects the central nervous system, primarily the brain. So it's going to cause things like incoordination, loss of fear, in bats, inability to fly. So a grounded bat could have rabies if you find a bat on your sidewalk or something like that, okay? The other thing that we often see with them is they're out in daylight hours and they're on very exposed surfaces. There's a bat roosting on the wall of a school cafeteria. Is that what you want to have around children, okay? There's another bat out. Important to take the season, the time of the year involved as well. Juvenile bats are out, they're volant later in August into September, and they're not the sharpest tools in the shed. They're just learning the ropes, right? They're not as sharp as their parents. And they tend to get themselves in situations that the adult bats won't get themselves in. So if this is a bat roosting on the side of a building, provided there's no human health concern, in other words, children can't reach up and grab that bat, or it's not over a doorway where it's going to fall down on somebody or something like that, it could be left for a period of time to assess, to see whether it flies away the next day, or if it moves somewhere else or something like that, right? If there's no risk to human health, you can monitor them for a period of time, because we are dealing with endangered species now, right? They're not just simply nuisance wildlife anymore, they are an endangered species, so sometimes it's worthwhile doing that type of assessment. Transmission, all you need to know, most often a bite wound or a scratch, you have to get that saliva from that animal that's affected with the rabies virus into your body somehow. And then the incubation period is variable and depends on the strain of the virus, the species affected, the amount of virus the amount of saliva or the dose of the virus you get, the site of where you were bitten, and the severity of the wound, because that virus needs to get access to nerves, okay? So for humans, unfortunately, our hands and our face are the most heavily innervated. And why I say unfortunately is because young children often will reach down with their hand to pet an animal or pick up an animal, and that's where the bite wound occurs. With bats, it can be very, very minor, as I'll show you in a second. With larger animals, it's those slashing bites, okay, that open up a lot of nerve endings that give the virus that much more access to get in, propagate, move to the brain, and cause the problems that we're talking about. So bats, sharp teeth and claws. So their little thumb claws are fairly sharp, okay? They've got very sharp scalpel-like teeth, okay, that you wouldn't even realize, you might not realize you were bitten by if you were actually bitten by them. And then they've got these very sharp claws on their back legs as well, right? So lots of potential for fairly minor contact that can cause a significant exposure to rabies. This is what we don't want to see. You already took this picture. He wanted me to make sure I highlighted that. That's not his hand, okay? But this is a bat rehabilitator. That's a mealworm in the mouth of this bat, and they're feeding this bat with bare hands. Not appropriate at all, okay? If you're going to be handling bats at all, you should be, if you're not doing it for biological reasons, where you're trying to manipulate it out of a net or handle it very carefully, you should have heavy leather gloves on that cover you right up your forearms, and then a shirt on so none of your skin is going to be exposed, okay? That's not what we want to see. Now I challenge anybody to see the bat bite in this picture if the circles weren't there to identify it. This one here, and again in this one over here, it's a little bit easier, Tessa's pointing them out over there, that you can see where that bat bit there, but again, pretty difficult to see in terms of recognizing where these bites occur. So what we want to see, and again you can see this is a northern myotis here, how sharp those teeth are. Look at those teeth there and how easy it would be for them to penetrate the skin. And again, we're wearing these latex gloves because we're manipulating animals in nets, releasing them. I need to have fairly good dexterity in my fingers to do a necropsy, and it's a dead animal. I can be a lot more careful. But for any of you guys, you should have leather gloves on and, like I said, appropriately covered. So the concern with a lot of things are these cryptic cases of rabies, and this is where people die of rabies, but there's no clear history that they've been exposed to a bat. Now that could be because the incubation period is so highly variable in rabies. It's anywhere from several weeks to several months to possibly over a year. So perhaps people just forget that they've had contact with that. But they go back to the family and they have these extensive case history investigations and can't identify a contact with the bat. So again, that seems to point out that minor contact with the bat can lead to significant exposure to rabies, potentially. So in the US, 89% of the 28 human rabies cases since 1980 have been cryptic. So 90% of the people that have gotten rabies can't remember being in contact with the bat that gave them rabies. Now, I want you to do the math here too, right? So 1980 to 2002 when the paper was published, that's 22 years, there were 28 human rabies cases in all of the US. Roughly a little over one case per year with all the millions of people there. So let's balance this, folks. You know, it's not a huge concern. It's a huge concern from the fact that if you get rabies, you're going to die of it. But what I'm saying is we don't have to have the big fear factor there. That we have to balance things with what the actual exposure and number of cases are. There's also been a lot of post-exposure prophylaxis that's occurred that's protected people from rabies as well. Since 2000, there have been 4 rabies-related human fatalities in Canada involving the bat strain of the virus. So BC, just that last summer, a young gentleman got out of a car on the side of the road, had apparent minor contact with a bat that flew into him. He died of rabies several months later. Alberta, 2007, BC, 2003, Quebec in 2000, and Nova Scotia was the last case in Atlantic Canada in 1977 with a bat variant of rabies, okay? This case in Alberta is kind of sad, maybe because I'm approaching the age of 73 years old. I feel sad when people die at that age. But this man in northern Alberta was bitten by a bat on his shoulder in his home in August 2006, developed severe pain at the site of the bite in January 2007, and was dying of rabies in the hospital by March 2007. That was a preventable death. Right? All that individual had to do was contact their Department of Public Health and say, I was bitten by a bat, and they would have treated the person effectively and he would have survived likely, okay? So human rabies, like I said, several days to 8 months or more. You don't need to know all these clinical signs associated with it. Just know that the outcome is death. Some people talk about this Milwaukee protocol. What they do is they induce a coma in the affected person, and supposedly they will survive. The literature's coming out more and more. There was a paper published in 2016 saying that they should stop the Milwaukee protocol because it has not been proven effective and that they don't believe that it is an appropriate treatment for rabies. So once you start to show clinical signs of rabies, you're going to die of rabies. Basically, that's the truth. So what about prevention? So that's what we want to do. We want to prevent. So we talked about wearing the gloves and that sort of thing, okay? So number one, it hinges on 4 basic principles. Number one, you vaccinate animals which may be exposed to wildlife reservoirs of rabies and subsequently come in close contact with us. So vaccinate our cats and dogs, okay? Avoid contact with potentially infected animals. That's a problem. For a lot of the pest control operators here, nuisance wildlife control operators, a lot of the conservation officers, that sort of thing, veterinarians and that, we can't avoid contact with potentially infected animals. It's part of our job, right? We have to do it. So what do we do if we have to do it? If there's a high risk of occupational exposure, consider prophylactic rabies vaccination. So I got vaccinated in 1986 when I went to vet school. You need to have your titers checked every 2 years to see that your titer is still safe and protects you. And I still have a protective titer all those years later. So it's a great vaccination, it's a great investment, and so that's the recommended route to go for sure, okay? If exposure occurs, so if you get bitten by a bat and you know that and that, wash it well with soap and water, use alcohol or some other like a quaternary ammonium compound or something to rinse it out, apply other treatment to get the bleeding to stop and that sort of thing. And then go to your doctor or call the Department of Health, the health line, and say, I was bitten by a bat. Don't expect them to figure it out and that you're worried that you may have been exposed to rabies, okay? That's what you have to do. I like this one here because, again, people in New Brunswick, I'm always amazed by them. They always catch me on things, okay? So this is what I said up in Bathurst. If possible, kill the animal involved and submit it immediately for rabies diagnosis. So what other diseases do bats carry that we might have to be worried about? Okay, so here's another fungal disease that bats carry that doesn't cause disease in them but can cause disease in humans, okay? It's a fungus called Histoplasma capsulatum. It's got all these other special names basically because of people crawling around in caves and that sort of thing. It tends to be in the Ohio or Mississippi Valley in this area, also in the Ottawa River Valley and spreading down through the St. Lawrence, okay? It's thermally dimorphic, that just means it's a yeast in the body and it's a mycelial form when it's growing in the soil. So we see it sort of in Ontario and Quebec and that sort of thing. We've had this one case that occurred in a dog in New Brunswick that did not travel. The only complicating factor was that dog was born in Ottawa and spent 8 weeks of its life in Ottawa as a puppy before it was sent here. So had it been harboring that fungus for a long period of time and subsequently became immunosuppressed and then got the disease, or is it actually present and around here somewhere? I mean, when you look at the habitat here and you look at climate change coming and you've got the St. John River Valley, it seems like it would be a pretty good habitat for it. So it's something that perhaps we should maintain surveillance and keep on the lookout for. I wouldn't be surprised if it showed up here. So again, it thrives in organic nitrogen-rich soil, particularly those contaminated by bird droppings or bat guano, okay? So this is the situation that you guys deal with here, and also a lot of pigeon and other starling and that sort of thing, but pigeons are a big one, as well as gulls can carry this as well, okay? So here's the bat species that carry it that we know. So the big brown bat for sure, the little brown myotis, the tricolored bat carries it. So we've got all those bats here, so there's no reason whatsoever that it might not show up. The clinical signs of the disease, it's a respiratory disease. It affects your lungs, okay? And again, what you're doing is you're sweeping up guano in this area. It's dry, you're aerosolizing the spores and that from it, and then you're breathing it in and it's causing damage in your lungs and that sort of thing. Look at the 3 distinct forms of it though. The most common are asymptomatic. In other words, you get exposed to it, your body's immune system deals with it, and you don't even know you had it. You might have had a mild flu-like illness or something like that, and you don't even know it. Occasionally you get respiratory disease, which is basically a pneumonia, okay, from it, and it can occur very quickly, depending if you get exposed to a lot of it, or it can be chronic. It can sit there for a long period of time and come up after exposure several years ago, potentially, because it sits there and just waits for the right time. Disseminated disease, where it spreads throughout the body, affecting many organs in the body, is very rare, and if only tends to affect immunocompromised people, people that would have AIDS, or on treatment for cancer that with immunosuppressive drugs and that sort of thing. So if you know you've got an immunocompromising disease, you're not going to want to be going around crawling in attics that's full of bat guano and that sort of thing, because you're potentially exposing yourself to something significant, okay? Not important in terms of diagnosis, just important to know that if you get the disease, it can be treated with antifungal medication. And again, I just highlight this again. If you go to your doctor, if you're up crawling around in an attic and then you get this, pneumonia afterwards, I would advise you to tell your doctor you were crawling around in an attic where there was lots of bat guano and you're worried about histoplasma, because human physicians often do not think about these types of diseases. They're thinking about the common colds and flus that are in the community at the time, and that's what they'll assume you have, unless you protect yourself by giving them the right history. High occupation in terms of exposure to this, well, there's lots of people, okay, but again, I just want to highlight that you guys are on the list here, okay. The other thing is this ecotourism. Recognize there's been several Canadian school trips that have gone down to kind of explore bat caves in Central and South America, and kids have come back sick with histoplasmosis. So just recognize that when you're doing these types of activities that your exposure to things, but again, like roofers, restorers of abandoned buildings, so on and so forth, okay? This was a neat story in Quebec that was published, and they were doing a renovation of an old brick farmhouse. They saw a large quantity of dried bird or bat droppings behind the bricks. The demolition work was reported to have caused a cloud of dust in the immediate environment. As they were taking the wall down, it collapsed, and this huge cloud of dust came up, okay? So of the masons that were taking it apart, there were 6 of them, and 6 of them got histoplasmosis. The bricklayers that came in after everything was clean and everything like that, 4 of them worked there, none of them got histoplasmosis. The debris sorters that would have been sorting through the debris and everything, 3 of them got histoplasmosis. The metal workers that came afterwards for the roof and everything like that, 2 of them, 0 of them got histoplasmosis. 2 out of 4 of the residents that lived in the house got it. 2 out of 8 of the neighbors got histoplasmosis that lived nearby. And then 1 out of 3 visitors got it, okay? So if you're doing things that are creating this large clouds of dust and everything like that, you're gonna cause problems. So with guano, you wanna wet it down with a 10% bleach solution and kind of mop it up or shovel it up as a wet material. You don't wanna be working with dry material unless you've got HEPA filters and that sort of thing to protect yourself, okay? So again, lots of ways to prevent it. Health wardings, exclude bird flocks and bat colonies from buildings if it's a significant problem, so on and so forth. Control dust, particularly on windy days, dust suppression and that sort of thing. Disinfect or decontaminate material, I said that. And then these filters, okay? Make sure you have a TC-84A particulate filter if you're going to be working in these environments. Last but not least is bat bugs, okay, and they're the genus Cimex, and again, they've been with bats forever. They jumped to us when we shared caves with bats, and they jumped to birds when birds were sharing caves with bats. Certain birds like swallows have their own species of a bug like this. Our bug we all know very well, it's called the bed bug, and we know that there's an emergence of that. It's the Cimex lectularius, okay? And it kind of changed over from a bat bug over time, and the only way you can differentiate it is by looking at these areas of the 2 species to differentiate between them, okay? They're temporary ectoparasites. In other words, they jump on you like a mosquito to take a blood meal, and then they leave to go away and digest that disease. The important thing to realize is that bat bugs are not known to carry any other diseases that can affect us as humans, okay? So we don't have to worry about that. And we know that C. adjunctus or Cimex adjunctus, the bat bug, has been recorded from both Newfoundland and Nova Scotia bats, and likely if we went looking for it here, we would find it here. I wouldn't be surprised. And again, here's the kind of common story. 19-year-old student home from university for the Christmas holiday developed a crop of obviously intensely itchy insect bites. A search of his bed found some red-brown crawling insects about the size of a lentil. The bats had left in the autumn. Examination of the house found the bugs issuing forth from a gap in the floorboards in a bathroom cupboard immediately above the roost, okay? So the bats had left, the insects are getting hungry, they're searching for a host, and they happen to feed on this student that was home. And so what you want to do is integrated pest management. You want to have professionals deal with this. Exclusion of bats, that's what Tessa's going to talk about this afternoon, so that you'll do it in a way that protects the bats and they won't reintroduce the bat bugs. And then you have to follow with sanitation and application of insecticides by a licensed professional pest control operator. And that's all my doom and gloom. I'm done.